There's a specific category of truth worth examining directly, not the structural, permanent costs we've traced extensively throughout previous conversations, but something more private, the specific things he genuinely, actively conceals after betraying you, hidden not just from you and from mutual connections, but often from himself as well. Today, we're tracing exactly what these concealed truths consist of, why they remain buried even from his own conscious awareness, and why understanding them offers something genuinely valuable for your own healing. Let's start with the first thing he never tells anyone, because understanding its specific nature reveals something important about how deeply this concealment operates. The first thing, he genuinely doesn't fully understand why he did it. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the structural, rather than simply reluctant, nature of narcissistic psychology. Betrayal, when it occurs, rarely emerges from clear, conscious reasoning he could articulate honestly even if he wanted to. It emerges from the deeper mechanisms this entire series has traced extensively. The hollow core requiring external material, the inability to tolerate genuine vulnerability, the instinctive reach for whatever provides immediate relief from discomfort he cannot consciously name. This means when he offers explanations, to mutual friends, to a new partner, sometimes even to you directly, these explanations are typically retroactive constructions, plausible-sounding stories built after the fact, rather than accurate accounts of whatever actually drove the choice in the moment it occurred. Here's why this matters for your own understanding. If you've ever searched desperately for the real reason behind his betrayal, hoping that understanding his motivation might somehow resolve your own confusion, understand that the real reason likely isn't fully accessible even to him. He's not withholding a clear, honest explanation from you specifically. He genuinely doesn't possess one, because the actual mechanism driving his behavior operates below the level of conscious reasoning his defensive architecture allows him to access. The second thing, he genuinely misses something specific about you that he cannot admit to anyone, including his new partner. Remember everything we traced extensively throughout our conversation about what he actually lost. The specific quality of depth and perception that proves genuinely difficult to replace. This missing isn't something he can voice to a new partner without implicitly comparing her unfavorably, and it isn't something he can voice to mutual friends without risking the narrative management his psychological stability depends on. This means it exists as a private, unspoken ache, surfacing in quiet moments, in the specific, involuntary memory intrusions we traced throughout our conversation about what happens in his mind after the discard. It's never given voice because voicing it would require exactly the vulnerability his psychology cannot sustain in front of any audience, including an audience of one. The third thing, he's genuinely, quietly afraid he'll do this again to whoever comes next. This connects to something worth naming directly, distinct from anything we've traced extensively throughout this series before. Somewhere beneath his conscious awareness, in the specific window of private guilt we examined in our conversation about what narcissists do when they know they're guilty, exists genuine fear, not fear of consequence, but fear of his own pattern, fear that whatever produced this specific betrayal remains active and unresolved, ready to activate again with the next person who gets close enough to trigger it. This fear never gets voiced, because voicing it would require acknowledging the pattern exists at all, an acknowledgement his defensive architecture is specifically built to prevent, and this is where the hidden aftermath of betrayal becomes more complicated. Because what someone tells the world afterward is often very different from what they experience privately. After betraying you, he may construct a story that makes the decision appear simple. Perhaps you were too much. Perhaps the relationship was already broken. Perhaps he felt neglected. Perhaps he simply needed something different. These explanations can sound convincing because they provide a clean ending to something that was psychologically much messier underneath. But a clean explanation doesn't necessarily mean it is the complete explanation. The fourth thing he may never tell anyone is that part of him knows the betrayal permanently changed the way you see him. This matters because before betrayal, there was still a version of himself reflected through your eyes that he could access. You may have believed in his potential. You may have seen qualities in him that he struggled to see in himself. You may have given him the benefit of the doubt when other people wouldn't. You may have looked past his contradictions and continued believing there was something good underneath them. After betrayal, that reflection changes. He may never admit how significant that is, because admitting that he lost your respect is different from admitting that he lost your attention. Attention can sometimes be replaced. Respect is much harder to recover once someone has demonstrated that they were willing to violate something fundamental. And this is where the betrayal can create a private psychological contradiction. He may still want to believe that he is a good person while simultaneously knowing that someone who once trusted him now sees him differently because of what he chose to do. That contradiction can be uncomfortable. So instead of confronting it, the mind may protect itself by changing the story. She never understood me anyway. She was going to leave eventually. We were both unhappy. It wasn't really that serious. These explanations can reduce immediate discomfort because they move attention away from the decision itself and toward circumstances surrounding it. But circumstances don't erase responsibility. And this is important for your healing because you can stop waiting for him to give you a perfectly honest explanation before accepting what happened. You may never hear the full truth from him. You may hear several different versions. You may hear nothing. And none of those outcomes changes the fact that betrayal was a choice with consequences. The fifth thing he may never admit is that losing access to you can hurt in a completely different way than he expected. Before the betrayal, he may have assumed that some version of access would always remain available. Maybe he assumed you would eventually forgive him. Maybe he believed your emotional attachment would outweigh your disappointment. Maybe he believed that enough time would soften your boundaries. Maybe he simply assumed that because you had returned before, you would eventually return again. And when that assumption fails, the psychological impact can be much stronger than the original conflict. Because now he isn't simply dealing with the consequences of what he did. He's dealing with the realization that his prediction about you was wrong. He thought he knew how much you would tolerate. He thought he knew what would bring you back. He thought he understood the limits of your attachment. And then you stopped behaving according to the old pattern. That can create a very uncomfortable realization. I pushed too far, but that sentence may never be spoken. Sometimes it isn't even consciously acknowledged. Instead, it appears indirectly through irritation, curiosity, sudden attempts to reconnect, checking for information about your life, or an unexpected interest in whether you've moved on. And this is where you have to be careful. His curiosity about your life doesn't automatically mean genuine remorse. His missing you doesn't automatically mean he has changed. His regret about losing access doesn't automatically mean he understands the damage he caused. Those are separate things. A person can regret a consequence without fully accepting responsibility for the decision that produced it. That's why your healing cannot depend on interpreting every sign of regret as evidence of transformation. The sixth thing he may never tell anyone is that part of him may compare what came after you with what existed before the betrayal. This comparison isn't necessarily romantic or dramatic. Sometimes it is incredibly ordinary. A conversation doesn't feel as natural. Someone doesn't understand his moods in the same way. Someone doesn't notice small changes in his behavior. Someone doesn't have the same history with him. Someone doesn't respond to him with the same emotional depth. And suddenly something he once took for granted becomes noticeable precisely because it is absent. This is one of the strange consequences of losing someone who was deeply familiar with you. You often don't understand the value of certain forms of connection until you encounter their absence. But again, this doesn't mean the person will openly admit it. Acknowledging that they miss something about you can create vulnerability. It can also threaten the narrative they've built about why the relationship ended. So the comparison may remain private. And sometimes the person moves forward externally while carrying unresolved internal contradictions. They may look fine. They may appear confident. They may post pictures. They may enter another relationship. They may tell everyone they're happier now. None of those things necessarily reveal what is happening internally. But here's where the focus needs to return to you. Because there is a temptation after betrayal to become fascinated by what the betrayer is secretly thinking. And that fascination can become another form of emotional attachment. You begin asking, does he miss me? Does he regret it? Does he compare her to me? Does he know what he lost? Does he feel guilty? These questions are understandable. But notice what they all have in common. They keep your attention pointed toward him. And if you've spent months or years trying to understand someone who repeatedly hurt you, the last thing you need is another psychological puzzle keeping you connected. The most important hidden truth may therefore be something about you rather than him. You survived something you once believed you couldn't survive. You experienced betrayal without allowing it to become the definition of your worth. You learned that someone's choice to betray you does not automatically mean you were lacking. You learned that another person's inability to remain loyal is not proof that you were unworthy of loyalty. And eventually, you can reach a point where his private thoughts stop being necessary information. Whether he misses you or doesn't. Whether he regrets it or doesn't. Whether he understands or doesn't. Whether he tells anyone or never tells anyone. Your life can move forward regardless. Because the deepest form of closure isn't discovering the secret thoughts he keeps hidden. It's reaching a place where those thoughts no longer determine how you feel about yourself. And that realization leads into the final layer of what betrayal leaves behind, the truth he may never admit, even privately, about what your absence ultimately forced him to confront. And this is where the aftermath of betrayal reaches its deepest point, because eventually the question isn't simply what he hides from other people. It's what he has to live with when there is nobody left to perform for, nobody left to convince, and nobody left to blame. The external story can be controlled. The private experience is much harder to control forever. The seventh thing he may never tell anyone is that your absence can force him to encounter a version of himself he spent a long time avoiding. When you were still present, there may have been endless opportunities to redirect attention. Another argument, another accusation, another explanation, another crisis, another attempt to make you responsible for his emotional state. As long as the relationship remained active, there was always something happening between you that could keep attention away from the deeper question of what his own choices revealed about him. After you're gone, that distraction becomes harder to maintain. There is no longer an argument to win, no reaction to provoke, no explanation to manipulate, no emotional conversation to dominate, no immediate opportunity to rewrite what happened in front of you. And sometimes silence creates a kind of psychological space that wasn't available before. In that space, memories can return, not necessarily as dramatic moments of remorse, but as uncomfortable reminders. A conversation, a promise, a look on your face, a moment when you trusted him, a moment when he knew you were hurt and still continued. These memories don't require another person to be present. They exist internally. And this is where the difference between guilt and accountability becomes important. Someone can feel uncomfortable about what they did without developing the capacity to take full responsibility for it. They can regret the outcome without fully confronting the behavior. They can miss the person they hurt without becoming capable of treating the next person differently. They can even feel guilty and still protect themselves from that guilt through denial. So if you're wondering whether he secretly feels something, the honest answer is that you may never know. And more importantly, you don't need to know. Because your healing should not depend on successfully entering another person's private psychological world. The eighth thing he may never tell anyone is that betrayal can permanently change the meaning of certain memories. This is one of the most complicated parts of losing someone through betrayal. The good memories don't simply disappear. They remain. The laughter was real. The conversations were real. The moments of affection were real. The dreams you discussed may have been real to you. And yet, knowing what happened afterward can change the way you understand those memories. You may start wondering whether everything was fake, whether every loving moment was manipulation, whether you imagined the connection, whether you were completely wrong about who he was. But you don't necessarily have to erase the good to acknowledge the bad. A relationship can contain genuine moments of connection and still become deeply unhealthy. Someone can have cared about you in certain moments and still have behaved in ways that were profoundly damaging. The existence of good memories doesn't cancel the betrayal. And the betrayal doesn't necessarily mean every good memory was meaningless. This is important because healing often requires allowing yourself to hold complexity without forcing everything into one simple category. You don't have to decide that he was secretly evil from the beginning. You don't have to decide that the entire relationship was fake. You can simply say, whatever was genuine, whatever wasn't, this is what happened. And this is what I choose now. That sentence contains enormous freedom, because it removes the requirement to solve the entire past. The ninth thing he may never admit is that you may have become stronger precisely because you were forced to stop relying on him for answers. Betrayal can destroy an illusion, and while the destruction itself is painful, what comes afterward can be transformative. Before betrayal, you may have believed that love automatically meant loyalty. You may have believed that understanding someone's wounds would make them treat you better. You may have believed that giving enough chances would eventually produce appreciation. You may have believed that if you were patient enough, kind enough, understanding enough, the relationship would become safe. Betrayal can force you to question those assumptions, and eventually, you build something more realistic. You learn that love needs boundaries. You learn that words need consistent behavior behind them. You learn that forgiveness doesn't require renewed access. You learn that trust isn't owed simply because someone asks for it. You learn that your empathy needs discernment. And you learn that leaving doesn't mean you failed. Sometimes leaving is the first time you succeed at protecting yourself. And perhaps the most uncomfortable truth he may never tell anyone is that the person you become after the betrayal may no longer be someone he knows how to access. Not because you became cruel. Not because you became vindictive. Not because you spent your life trying to punish him. but because you stopped offering the version of yourself that was easiest to manipulate. You stopped over-explaining. You stopped chasing clarity from someone committed to ambiguity. You stopped trying to prove that your pain was legitimate. You stopped negotiating with disrespect. You stopped believing that his approval could restore your sense of worth. And this change may be visible from the outside. You become quieter, more selective, more intentional, less reactive, less interested in proving anything. And sometimes the greatest consequence of betrayal isn't that the betrayer suffers. It's that the person they betrayed eventually becomes unavailable to the old dynamic. That is a completely different kind of ending. And this is why you have to be careful with the fantasy of discovering what he secretly feels. Because the more you focus on whether he's hurting, the more you keep your emotional life connected to his. You don't need to know whether he lies awake thinking about you. You don't need to know whether he compares someone else to you. You don't need to know whether he secretly regrets the decision. You don't need to know whether he will ever admit what he did. Those things may remain mysteries forever, and your life can still become completely clear. You were betrayed. It hurt, it changed you. You learned from it, and you are allowed to move forward. Maybe one day he understands everything. Maybe he understands nothing. Maybe he tells a completely different story to everyone around him. Maybe he never speaks about it again. None of those possibilities determines what your healing becomes. Because closure isn't the moment another person finally tells the truth. Closure is the moment you stop needing their version of the truth to authorize your own. And perhaps that's the final secret hidden inside betrayal. The most important transformation doesn't happen inside the person who betrayed you. It happens inside the person who finally realizes they don't need to keep waiting for that person to become honest. You can stop watching, stop analyzing, stop checking, stop wondering, stop hoping for the perfect confession, and start living. The betrayal can remain part of your history without remaining the center of your identity. You don't have to forget what happened. You simply stop allowing it to decide what happens next. And one day, the question won't be, what does he secretly feel about losing me? It will be something much more powerful. What do I want my life to feel like now? That is the question that finally breaks the connection between your future and his choices. Because he may never tell anyone what he felt after betraying you. He may never tell himself the complete truth. But you can tell yourself the truth. You deserved honesty. You deserved respect. You deserved loyalty. And the fact that someone failed to give you those things was never proof that you were unworthy of them. It was proof that they were unable or unwilling to provide them. And once you understand that distinction deeply, the betrayal stops being the place where your story ended. It becomes the place where you finally stopped abandoning yourself.